The auctioneer drove the gavel down at $250 on a cold, clear October morning in 2005 at the Knox County Public Works Surplus Auction on the pier-yard pavement of the Rockland Fish-Pier in Rockland, Maine. And the man in the mustard-yellow city rain slicker standing on the upper pier let out a short, hard laugh that bounced off the hulls of the moored lobster boats and turned the heads of every coastal mechanic standing in the line of pickups along the dock. Edmund Crowley was 54, 5'9", and barrel-shaped, bald scalp polished by salt wind with a thin comb-over of mouse-gray hair, a double-chinned, clean-shaven jaw, sharp, pale, gray-green eyes behind gold-rimmed aviator glasses pushed up onto his head, a deep weather burn on his cheeks and nose. He wore a mustard-yellow, heavy industrial rain slicker, buttoned to the throat with the City of Rockland Public Works seal on the left breast pocket, high-visibility lime-green polyester pants tucked into dark green rubber bog boots, a stainless aluminum clipboard clamped under his left arm, and a chrome city-issue ballpoint pen clipped behind his right ear. He had been director of public works for Rockland for 11 years and had organized the surplus auction himself to clear the back lot of the old DPW garage on Tillson Avenue of equipment the city had inherited from the Knox County Marine Salvage Cooperative when that cooperative dissolved in 1995. The 1947 Mack B-61 wrecker at the end of the auction list had been the last lot of the morning, and Edmund Crowley had told the auctioneer privately the truck was sea-wrought iron and not worth the cost of hauling it to the crusher in Augusta. The 24-year-old shop mechanic in the deeply faded oilskin coat at the back of the bidders had just outbid him for $250 against Edmund's casual $50 opening shot. And Edmund was making sure the Rockland coastal mechanics understood the joke. Quincy Pemberton folded the auction slip into the inside pocket of his oilskin coat and walked across the pier yard to the truck. The B-61 was 23 feet of long-nose conventional cab New England iron. The cab painted a faded Mack maple brown, oxidized to a chalky tea brown along the body panels, and salt-blasted sea green along the lower edges of the doors where Atlantic spray had been hitting it for 58 winters. The chrome bulldog hood ornament still standing proud but tarnished to a dull pewter, the chrome Mack letters across the front of the long hood pitted with sea rust, both side mirrors snapped off at the brackets, the original Holmes 750 wrecker, boom with a hand-cranked twin-drum winch mounted on the rear deck, listing 2 degrees right, with both cables frayed and rusted, the wooden cargo deck rotted through, 3 of the 6 tires flat, and the word junk spray-painted in flaking buoy orange block letters across the driver's door. Quincy had grown up 2 miles down U.S. Route 1 from where this truck had last been parked. His grandfather, Oren Pemberton, was waiting at the trailer. Oren was 78, a retired Maine state ferry mate who had worked the Vinalhaven and Islesboro runs out of Rockland Harbor for 41 years, 5'9", lean and erect, with broad, bony shoulders and the sea stance of a deckhand, snow-white hair under a salt-stained dark navy wool watchcap pulled low, a thick white mustache, deep-set sea-gray eyes, in a face lined by 41 years of Maine weather, large knotted hands. He wore a faded yellow heavy cotton oilskin slicker open over a thick navy wool fisherman knit sweater, faded dark gray heavy twill work pants, scuffed brown leather sea boots, and a plain dark brown leather belt with a worn brass buckle stamped with a small anchor. A short clay churchwarden pipe with a small chip out of the bowl sat unlit between his teeth. Oren set one liver-spotted hand on the rusted fender of the Mack and stood there a long minute. He spoke quietly. He said, "Son, you bought Tolliver Magnusson's old B-61. Tolliver Magnusson had run Magnusson Marine Wrecker out of a small clapboard shop on the wharf-side of Tillson Avenue in Rockland from 1973 until the pier accident, pulling stuck fish trucks off the pier ramps, hauling overturned lobster pot wagons up out of the wet seaweed, dragging cracked diesel trucks off boatyard switchbacks above Camden Harbor. He had built the Holmes 750 wrecker boom himself onto the Mack's rear deck in 1974, with the help of 2 welders from the Bath Iron Works on a long weekend. He had married a Rockport girl named Iola Spear in 1973, and they had a son, Sailor, born in 1975. Tolliver had died in December of 1989. He had been working the upper pier with the Mack winching a stuck Maine State DOT plow truck out of a snowdrift when a worn link in the winch chain snapped and the recoil whipped the chain end across the pier and knocked Tolliver into the frozen tidal mud 12 feet below. He had broken his neck. He was 50 years old. Sailor was 14. The Mack had been moved off the pier by the Rockland harbor master and parked behind the Magnusson shop on Tillson Avenue. Iola had paid the city property tax on the shop for 6 years and then sold the wharf-side property to the City of Rockland in 1995. The Mack had been inherited by the Public Works Department and parked in the back lot of the DPW garage off Park Drive for 14 more years until Edmund Crowley decided to clear it out. Quincy had been at the auction because his grandfather had heard from a Vinalhaven dockmaster that Tolliver Magnusson's truck was finally being sold. They winched the B-61 onto Quincy's borrowed flatbed trailer. Edmund Crowley stood on the upper pier in his mustard-yellow slicker and watched, the aluminum clipboard under his arm. And as Quincy pulled out, he called across the pier-yard that when the boy was ready to admit defeat, the City of Rockland Department of Public Works would haul the sea rot to the crusher in Augusta for the cost of the diesel. Quincy did not answer. Oren climbed into the cab of the trailer truck, and they drove the 17 miles north, up U.S. Route 1 to Oren's small white clapboard cottage and timber-frame shed on the back of his land-facing Penobscot Bay, the dead Mack rocking behind them on the salted highway, the Holmes 750 booms pointing at the cold, gray October Maine sky like 2 crooked fingers. The restoration would take 19 years. Nobody knew that on the drive north. Quincy worked his day job at a small heavy truck shop in Belfast during the week, and he drove the 20 minutes south on Route 1 to Oren's shed every Saturday and most Sundays. They started with the engine because Oren insisted. The original Mack Thermodyne END673 inline-6 diesel had not turned over in 16 years, and they pulled it out of the truck with a chain hoist and tore it down on a stand. The bearings were salt-pitted but salvageable. The crank was true. The head needed a careful regrind. They pulled the 5-speed Mack manual and pressed new bushings into the shift tower. The first long Maine winter went into the engine and into stories about Tolliver Magnusson. Oren told Quincy about the morning in 1981 when Tolliver had pulled an overturned Rockland sardine truck out of the wet seaweed at half-tide and refused payment except for 2 crates of fresh sardines. He told Quincy about the night in 1985 when Tolliver had hauled a cracked Penobscot Bay Pilot diesel out of a Camden boatyard switchback in a freezing fog, and let the pilot pay him in a hand-bound Penobscot chart book. He told stories about Iola Magnusson's lobster pie. The second year, they sand-blasted the salt-rusted frame down to clean steel. By the fifth year, the cab came off. In the seventh year, Oren slowed. He had a small heart attack in February and was in the Penn Bay Medical Center in Rockport for 11 days. He came home thinner and quieter, but his hand still worked. He told Quincy the truck would wait. By the 10th year, the Mack was a roller. In the 12th year, Quincy's daughter was born, and the work paused for a month. By the 14th year, Oren sat more than he stood. He worked from a folding wooden chair beside the shed wood stove, the clay churchwarden pipe still between his teeth, the salt-stained watch cap pulled low against the bay wind that always blew through the shed cracks, and he pointed at what to do next. Through all of it, Edmund Crowley drove his white city-issue Ford pickup with the City of Rockland Public Works decals past the foot of Oren's driveway, sometimes on his way to a coastal road call, and the truck always slowed at the foot of the drive, but never quite turned in. By the 17th year, the Mack was painted. They had wet-sanded and primed and laid down a deep, glossy Mack maple brown that matched a faded snapshot Oren had of the truck from 1976. And they had masked off the driver's door with blue painter's tape around a rectangle where the flaking buoy orange junk paint still showed through, and they had left it there. Quincy did not know why. He just left it. By the 18th year, the Holmes 750 booms were rebuilt with fresh aircraft-grade twin-drum cables. By the 19th year, the Mack was nearly whole. They had not yet pulled the power takeoff shaft for fresh bearings. The PTO assembly was the last thing on the list, because Oren always said you start with what makes the truck move and you finish with what makes the boom climb. On a cold, clear morning of December the 8th of the 19th year, Quincy pulled into Oren's timber-framed shed with a fresh set of PTO bearings and a long brass pin punch. He was 43 years old. The dark blonde at his temples had gone steady silver. The small white scar across the back of his left hand from a barb-tipped gaff hook in 2015 was a thin line. His hands had the thickness of a man who had spent half his life under hoods. Oren was 97. He sat on his folding wooden chair beside the shed wood stove with a heavy plaid wool blanket over his knees, the salt-stained dark navy wool watch cap pulled low, the clay churchwarden pipe between his teeth, the yellow oilskin slicker open over the navy fisherman knit sweater. Quincy pulled the PTO assembly out of the side of the Mack's transmission and set the assembly on 2 sawhorses at the workbench. He started to slide the new bearings onto the splined shaft, and he stopped. There was something arc-welded to the underside of the splined PTO shaft housing, where the spline gear engaged the transmission. He could see the small steel pocket plainly now that the assembly was out of the truck and rotated on the sawhorses. He set the bearings down. He took a small magnet on a flexible wand from the bench drawer and gently confirmed the pocket. The magnet stuck immediately. He took an angle grinder with a cut-off wheel and cut a careful, slow seam along the upper 3 sides of the welded pocket. The pocket hinged downward on the unwelded 4th side. Inside the pocket, wrapped in 2 layers of waxed butcher paper, bound with brown twine, was a small, flat oilcloth bundle. He carried the bundle to the workbench under the clip-on lamp and cut the twine and unfolded the oilcloth 2 layers deep. Inside were 4 things. There was a tight roll of folded $20 bills wrapped with a piece of brown twine, 85 bills in 1980s Federal Reserve paper, totaling $1,700. There was a heavy brass ferry pilot's whistle on a tarnished steel chain. The side of the whistle stamped Maine State Ferry Service, 1947 in narrow block letters above a small enameled blue and white state flag emblem. There was a small black and white photograph mounted on stiff paperboard showing a small boy of about 5 sitting at the wheel of a Maine State Ferry wheelhouse with the Penobscot Bay lighthouses visible through the wheelhouse glass. The date, August 1980, written on the back, in pencil. And there was a folded single sheet of plain yellowed lined paper, the creases brittle, the ink faded but legible. Quincy unfolded it. The handwriting was small and careful and slanted slightly to the right. The letter was dated December the 14th of 1989. It read, "To Sailor. The cash is for whatever a young man needs cash for at 18. The whistle is your grandfather Wallace's. He blew it on the Vinalhaven run for 32 years, from 1947 until he retired in 1979, and he gave it to me on my 18th birthday in 1957. The photograph is of you the morning your grandfather let you steer the Governor Curtis past Owl's Head Light. I am welding these to the back of the PTO shaft because the chain link on the upper pier winch has been showing wear all autumn, and I do not want them lost if anything happens to me on the pier this December. The truck is yours when you are old enough to drive her without breaking her. Your father, Tolliver Magnusson, Rockland, Maine, December 14th, 1989. Quincy sat on the workbench. He read the letter twice. He handed it to his grandfather, and Oren held it in both hands and read it once and set it down. He said quietly, "Tolliver wrote this 6 days before the chain snapped on the pier." The boy never knew. They drove south to Camden the next Saturday. Oren had called a Vinalhaven dock master whose nephew built wooden boats in the small Camden Harbor boatyard, and the dock master had given them a current address on Bayview Street in Camden. They drove down Route 1 under a clear, cold December Maine sky and pulled into a small graveled lot beside a clapboard wooden boat workshop on the harbor side of Bayview Street. And the man who came out wiping mahogany shavings off his hands in a workshop apron was 49 years old. He had Tolliver Magnusson's broad shoulders and his father's deep-set steel-gray eyes. He wore a heavy navy wool boat-builder's apron over a dark blue cotton work shirt, faded brown duck canvas work trousers, scuffed brown leather lace-up sea boots, and a thin silver dolphin pendant at his throat. Oren spoke first. He said, "Son, I knew your father. He worked on his Mack in my shed in 1983. My grandson here bought the B-61 at the Knox County Surplus Auction 19 years ago, and we have been restoring her ever since. And we found something welded to her PTO shaft that belongs to you." Sailor's face changed. He brought them into a small workshop office, and they sat at a maple work table, and Quincy set the 4 items down one at a time. The cash first, then the whistle, then the photograph. He saved the letter for last. Sailor picked up the brass whistle. He turned it slowly between his fingers and blew it softly once, and it rang clear off the workshop walls. He said his grandfather Wallace had run the Vinalhaven for 32 years. that the family had been told the whistle had been sold to a Camden antique dealer in 1992, and that he had been looking for that whistle for 31 years. He picked up the photograph. He held it for a long time. He read the letter twice. He did not cry until the second reading. He asked finally if he could see the truck. They drove him north to Rockland the next morning. Sailor stood in the open bay of Oren's shed and walked slowly around the Mack 3 times. He ran his hand along the chrome Mack letters and the bulldog hood ornament. He stood at the driver's door where the flaking buoy orange junk was still masked off in blue tape. He turned to Quincy and he asked the price. Quincy looked at his grandfather. Oren laid both hands on the arms of the wooden chair and said, "Son, the truck is yours, but not the way you mean. We are going to finish her. We are going to paint over the door so the junk is gone. And then we are going to drive her down U.S. Route 1 to Tillson Avenue in Rockland and park her in front of the empty wharf-side lot where Magnusson Marine Wrecker stood until the pier accident. And we are going to paint your father's name on the door in clean white the way he had it in 1973. The boy paid $250 at auction. The truck is his on the paper. The work is his by the doing. But the name on the door belongs to your father and your grandfather and you. They finished the Mack through that winter. Sailor drove up from Camden every other Sunday, and he worked alongside them, and he brought wood-shaving sawdust on his clothes that smelled like fresh mahogany. On the morning of April the 11th of the 20th year, they rolled the B-61 out of Oren's shed under a clear blue Maine sky, and they drove her in convoy south on U.S. Route 1 down to Tillson Avenue in Rockland and parked her facing the empty wharf-side lot where Magnusson Marine Wrecker had stood until December of 1989. Quincy handed Sailor a small can of deep maple brown paint and a 1-inch brush. Sailor climbed up on the running board and he painted out the flaking buoy orange junk on the driver's door. He waited an hour. He opened a can of clean white lettering paint, and in his father's careful slant, he painted across the door in clean, clear letters, Magnusson Marine Wrecker, established 1973. Old enough to drive her without breaking her. He stepped down. A white city-issue Ford pickup with City of Rockland Public Works decals went by on Tillson Avenue. Edmund Crowley was driving. He slowed almost to a stop. He looked at the Mack, at the empty wharf-side lot with the maple brown door and the clean white lettering. He looked at the 4 people on the gravel. He did not laugh. He drove on. The Mack sits on Tillson Avenue in Rockland today, and the sign on the door reads, Magnusson Marine Wrecker, established 1973. Sailor Magnusson builds wooden boats in the small Camden Harbor Boatyard. The $1,700 sits in a small lockbox at his workshop. The brass Maine State Ferry Service whistle hangs on a small brass hook above his maple work table, and he blows it at the start of every new hull. The 1980 photograph is framed on the wall above his bench. The letter is in a small fireproof safe in his workshop closet. He reads it once a year on the 14th of December. If you ever see an old Mack B-61 parked along a Knox County wharf with the words Magnusson Marine Wrecker painted on the door in clean white, slow down, roll the window down, and listen. There is a story in that truck that a man in a mustard yellow rain slicker would have hauled to the crusher for the cost of the diesel, and the work was always for the boy. Subscribe to Iron Hook Stories for a new story every day. Thank you for watching.